I guess I'm just going to give everybody just a few minutes to get on here. But we'll be in 1 Corinthians chapter 9 this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 will be in verses 19 through 23. Give a few more folks a little more time to get on there. First Corinthians chapter 9 will be in verses 19 through 23. And as we get to our text, one of the questions I want to be able to ask is, what is your greatest priority? And that's something we all deal with, is our priorities. What is our priority? Every culture has priorities, and most of the time our priorities, they may not be just alike, but we have some of the same foundations as you go through culture after culture. There's a desire for peace. There's a desire for prosperity. There's a desire for respect. There's all kinds of desires that we have going on in our lives. But for us as Christians, what's your priority? And the reason that we need to ask that is our priorities sometimes need to be fixed. We need to get our priorities back in line. And so Paul, as he's writing to this church at Corinth, they're a church. I know a lot of times we look at this church and we think, wow, this is a messed up church, but they're still a church, and they had some problems with their priorities. And Paul is bringing out that his priority, the priority of those who are followers of Christ, is to win people for the gospel. That is our priority in life, is to worship God and bring people to God, and to worship God through the gospel of Jesus Christ. So we're going to read here in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 19 through 23. He says, "For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I may win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings." And so, as we look at the gospel and the priority of the gospel, it's very noble for us to have that priority of the gospel. But one of the things that Paul is willing to do here, and as he's bringing out here, Paul is willing to give up his freedoms. So his priority of the gospel is greater than his desire to be free, or his liberties, or his own personal comfort. Paul is a person that wants people to hear the gospel, and he understands if we're going to reach people for the gospel, we've got to reach, is the other people lost sound? Because I'm just putting this straight on my phone. I don't have any microphones or anything set up. This is very basic. But anyhow, maybe you guys can hear. Okay, some of you still have it. But anyhow, we get back to Paul. Paul understands that the way that he shares the gospel is going to be different with the different people that he comes in contact with. If you study the book of Acts, or you study how Paul interacts with people, one of the things that you're going to find is the way that Paul would preach the gospel to the Jewish people would be different than how he dealt with the Gentile people. And I would dare to say that there were, if Paul was in one part of the Gentile people, because it's very easy for the Jews, they say either Jewish or Gentile, but we got to understand this map. I've got a map of the world behind me here, and it's very easy to say, what is this culture like, and what's that culture like? And it's an interesting thing about cultures. We try to find culture, and as I'm trying to start a church here in Forestell, I'm learning there's a culture here, even though this is a very most of the people that live in Forestell now have only lived here for maybe 2, 3, 4 years. So it's a changing culture, but it's a culture. Even as you live in this area and you go across the Missouri River into St. Louis County, there's a whole other culture there. And as we think about culture, there's a culture that I grew up with. And that, just in the United States, I grew up in a Southern culture, in an Arkansas culture, a very small town culture. But then I come up here to this Midwestern culture, and there's people from all over the world right here. And my goal and my priority is to reach the people that are here around me in Forestell. And if I'm going to do that, I've got to get into their culture. I've got to care about who they are, where they come from, why they think the way that they do, and to be able to reach in there. And so as Paul is writing to the church at Corinth, it is a blended culture of people. There are people, the thing about Corinth, nobody's from Corinth. Corinth is one of those trade towns. It's very, I heard Tim Keller speaking about Corinth one time, and he says it's very much like New York City. Very few people are from New York City. It's a place where you go to make it. You go to this place to become wealthy. You go to this place to display your talents. And Corinth would have been a very similar place to this. It's a trade town. It's a very wealthy town. It's an entertaining town. It's a place where people would go, and there's all these cultures from all around the world. But the biggest thing that he's seeing is the culture of the Jewish people and the Gentile people, which is a big culture clash. And Paul is bringing out, hey guys, the gospel is what holds us together. The gospel is what we stand on. There are a lot of things in culture that really don't matter when it comes down to the gospel. It doesn't make a person a Christian or not a Christian. There are things in our culture that they don't have eternal weight, is what I'm trying to say. And what Paul is getting at, we got to get into the culture to be able to reach these people. And so as Paul, here's what we find as Christians. Winning people to Christ is a priority. That's our priority. That is our job. That's the command that Christ gave. Go and preach the gospel. And when we do this, Paul is bringing out a concept here of doing it well and preparing ourselves to be able to reach people with the gospel. And so he's using some keys here to reach into the culture and reach people for Christ. So the first thing that I'm going to bring out here is Paul brings out to surrender to the culture. Now, I know that whenever I say surrender to the culture, there's going to be people that are going to start backing up and start saying, wait a minute, we don't surrender to the culture. We can't surrender to a sinful culture. Well, let's just be honest. All cultures have sin. All cultures have problems. All cultures are made up of people. Even churches are made up of people. And so, you know what you find even in a church culture? You got sinners and you got sin. And so we're dealing with that. And so as we go into different cultures, surrendering to different cultures is not surrendering to the sin of the culture. It's surrendering to things. It's giving up our liberties and our abilities and our freedoms to live however we want to under Christ. We've been given freedom under Christ, but it's giving up those things so that I can learn from this culture so that I can reach into this culture. My culture doesn't matter. I'm a citizen of heaven. I may be still a citizen of the United States, but my priority is my citizenship of Jesus Christ. And so as I'm going into this culture, Paul is bringing out, he says, I'm a free man. And one of the things we learn about Paul is he's a free man. He's a Roman citizen, which makes him free legally on the earth. But he's also a citizen of heaven. And his citizenship in heaven is more important to him than his citizenship of Rome or Jerusalem or any other heritage out there. But Paul, as he's surrendering to this, he's not, like I say, he's not surrendering to the culture of the sin culture, but he's surrendering to the culture that they have. They have values in their culture, and they have these values that they hold true, and they have values that mean something to them. And if we're ever going to go into another group of people, even people that look like us and talk like us, but they have different culture because they're not Christians. There's a different culture between Christians and not Christians. We need to learn what they value, learn how they what they hold true and what is important in their life. Sometimes if we'll just sit down and listen, they want the same things as we do. They want peace, they want security, they want to be successful. They want a lot of things that we want. It's just the way that they prioritize it, the way that they live it out is a little different. And so every culture, basically there's some big questions that every culture is trying to answer. They're trying to answer, why are we here? You go to any university and they're going to be talking about that. Why are we here? Why are we on this earth? How did we get here? And every culture is trying to answer those questions. What's important in life? What's wrong with this world? Every culture knows that there's something wrong with the world and they're here for a reason. So let this kind of sink in and learn what's going on. And not only that, but they're trying to figure out ways to fix the problem, whatever they see the problem as. And so it's Paul is going to these different places. He's using this ability to surrender himself to the culture so that he can learn what are they looking for. And you can find in the book of Acts in chapter 17 and verse 22, when Paul is in Athens, he's there in Athens, he's looking around their places of worship, he's looking at their culture, and he's trying to figure out, how can I, a Jew, reach into this culture of polytheistic, a multitude of different gods, and how can I take them to the one true God? And so Paul, when he says, guys, you're too superstitious. And that doesn't mean necessarily that he's saying they're wrong. Another way of saying it is you're very religious. And he's basically giving them a compliment as he's saying, guys, you're trying very hard to reach God. It's a noble thing. Trying to think outside of this world. Trying to think about God. Trying to focus upon God. Trying to find a way to appease God. That's a very noble thing. They've got their minds in the right direction, but they don't know who God is. They just know there is a God. And Paul also kind of uses an analogy. He says, you guys, you're like blind people searching around in the darkness and you're trying to find God. You're looking for God and just hoping you might bump into Him. So what he's saying here is, guys, let me tell you about the one true God. This God that you have. They had a plaque to a God that was an unknown God. And so Paul he surrenders to their culture, and then he finds the common ground. And so as we're going along, some of the keys of serving God and being successful and sharing the gospel, first of all, it's the Holy Spirit that does it. It's not us. It's God, it's the Holy Spirit. But we surrender to the culture, and then we find the common ground. And in the common ground, you see, there's something Paul writes to the church at Rome. He writes to them as in the very first chapter 1 and chapter 2, he writes to them that within all of us, there's a common sense of right and wrong. Those that have the law, talking about the Jews, they have it, and it points them to God. But those who don't have the law also have it written in their hearts. There is within them, written in their hearts, this law of right and wrong. Every society knows it's wrong to kill. Every society has rules that they hold up in high priority because it's important. Life is important. And as we see this, we find the common ground. Every culture is going to have something that God has placed in them that's pointing them to God. No, that's not pointing them to Jesus. It's not revealing the point of salvation and how that Christ died for us. That's our job. But we do find these common ground. And Paul acknowledges the church there in Athens and trying to reach them. And Paul is comparing them, like I said, he's comparing them as blind people reaching out, trying to find God. They're just feeling around. They don't know what's out there. And that's the way the world is. And many cultures are like this, trying to reach out to God. And so what we are to be doing is finding that common ground. What are they looking for? What do they value? What is it that they're searching for? And be able to reach in with them with the common things. So Paul, he reached to their culture. He reached into their culture. Paul even uses their literature to bring out the truth about God, how that we're the offspring of God. So even your own poets say that we're not made out of silver and gold, so God can't be silver and gold. So he's using their literature, he's reaching into their culture, finding their desires and their hopes. And their desire and hope was to have peace with God. That's why they were reaching out to all these gods. They're making these sacrifices to all these gods just in case there's a God of fertility, just in case there's a God of water, just in case there's a God of the sun, just in case there's a God of moon. And they're just trying to figure it out. And so Paul, he points them, he takes them to the common ground, and then he takes them to Jesus. How that there's one God. He goes from a plurality of gods that they're trying to appease, and says there's only one God who created all these things. And even your writers know that God's not gold, he's not stumped, he's not inaudible and immobile object. He's a spirit. And so as he's doing these things, as he's working with them and trying to find that common goal, he's keeping the gospel central. And so the last thing that we do, that Paul is doing here, he's keeping the gospel the central theme of everything he does. Paul's not out here just trying to be accepted by the culture. Paul's not out there just trying to make cultural change. He's not trying to be a social activist. What he's trying to do is bring the people to the truth of Jesus Christ. And he does that by finding out what does their culture value, what does their culture need, and what is their common ground. Now let's bring this up to the root, the real true God, Jesus Christ. And so as we keep this, the gospel is going to be offensive. That's something that we know. You start telling people about Jesus, they're going to be offended. People are going to get mad about Jesus. It's a crazy world that we live in, that you can talk about Jesus, who is the greatest man, and you just take out the deity of Jesus. He's the greatest man that ever lived. His teachings are awesome. He's the greatest one to ever live. Why are people mad about Jesus? They're not mad about Jesus for turning the other cheek. They're not mad about Jesus for being kind and being good and doing good for those who hate you and those things. They're mad about Jesus because he says, I'm the only way. You can't be right with God without me. And that's offensive. And so there's something about the gospel. There's a lot of things about the gospel that's just offensive. But a lot of times when we start trying to reach people and we have good intentions about sharing the gospel with someone and telling them that there's a hell and all these things, and that's true. But a lot of times we offend people with things that are cultural things that have nothing to do with the gospel. It won't make it into eternity. It probably won't last. Whatever it is that you offended them over won't last past your generation. So why are we spending time on things that really don't matter and trying to change people to our way of thinking? We're not building our kingdom. We're building the kingdom of heaven. We're telling people about Jesus. So we need to be careful that we don't go in offending people by a cultural thing. Go in there and figure out what's going on in their life. And when we take time to surrender to the culture and we take time to find the common ground, people will know that we care about them. And as people begin to know that we care about them, they're more likely to allow us to engage in the gospel with them and have a meaningful conversation with them in the gospel. And so as we look at this, many times, like I say, people are offended by the cultural differences that we come up with, and we're offending them because of one thing or another. And we like to say, well, they just don't want to hear anything about Jesus. And although that might be true, we've never even been concerned about being friends or caring about people. You see, the thing about Jesus cared about people. Jesus loved people. Jesus reached out to people in their culture. You say, well, they were all Jews. No, they were not all Jews. Jesus also reached a few Gentiles, and Jesus reached the Samaritans, and that's a big deal right there. If you don't know anything about the Jews and the Samaritan relationship, they're really close kin, but they don't like each other. In fact, when Jesus goes to the woman at the well, the interesting thing about Jesus as he goes to the woman at the well, the very first thing he says is, hey, can you give me a drink? And she looks at him very emphatic. How are you, a Jew, speaking to me, asking me for a drink? There was tension between the Jews and the Samaritans, and Jesus could have offended her before he ever got a drink. And even when Jesus brings up her relationship that she's in, he says, go get your husband. And she says, I don't have a husband. And he says, yeah, you're right. You've been married 5 times, I believe it is. And the man that you're with right now, he is not your husband. Jesus is not bringing this up to condemn her. Jesus knows that in the Samaritans' culture, their idea of the Messiah is he's going to be able to tell them everything. So if you remember, whenever she goes to town and tells everybody about Jesus. She says, hey, come see a man who told me everything. So Jesus knows her culture. He spends time in her culture. He's showing kindness. He confronts her sin. But before, he's not just out there confronting her sin, he's revealing to her culturally, I know what you're looking for in the Messiah, and I'm him. He's revealing that to her. He knows where she's at, and he's reaching her where she's at. And through this, notice what Paul says. Paul says, I'm doing all these things. To the weak, I'm weak. To the strong, I'm strong. To the Hebrew, I'm a Hebrew. The Jews, I'm a Jew. A Gentile, I'm a Gentile. All these things, I'm being all these things to these people so that I might save some or many. And what Jesus did with the woman at the well, he reached her in her understanding of God. And through her, many were saved because she went to town and told everybody, he's told me everything about himself. And they come out of the city and they come and they heard Jesus. Not everybody that came out to hear Jesus became Christians. But I'll tell you this, if Jesus didn't reach her in her culture and love her where she is and love her how she is, then he never would have reached the people in town. And so it's so important for us to go out and love people. So let me ask you this. Have you surrendered yourself to the culture around you? The thing about culture, sometimes our culture around us is It's different from one generation to the next. We can understand this. The way that I talk, and I work in the schools around here, and I go and around the kids, and some of the things that they're doing, I'm like, I don't have a clue what they're saying. They'll ask me something, and I'm like, I don't know what the words you're saying are coming out of your mouth. I don't know what they mean. So there's some different cultural things just from my generation to the kids that are growing up today and going through some things. But have we surrounded ourselves with the culture of today? You know, it's so easy to get caught up and stay in church, and we have what we call our holy huddles. We are so involved in church that we forget about having the balance of being around lost people. So how much time have you invested in conversation in those that are around you, listening to them, hearing their stories? You know, some people may not be turned off to the gospel. They're just turned off from some action of a church. Somebody's been ugly to them. Someone's mistreated them. Someone didn't care. And we need to be willing to listen to them instead of dismissing that. Try to reach them and say, look, you know, that church is full of sinners, and so am I. I'm a sinner. I'm just a mess. And the mess that you're in and the mess that I'm in, we can be in this mess together. But one thing that we can't do is we can't deny Jesus. And Jesus died for those people that messed up in your life. And Jesus died for you. And we can bring these people and the hurt and the problems that they're in, but we'll never learn those hurts. We'll never learn those problems if we don't take time to listen to them and purposely get into their culture, into their lives. Not only that, but here's the question here. Do you find yourselves angry over the things? I know that's real easy. You turn on the news, you see Facebook, you see all the stuff going on. It's real easy to get mad at the stuff that's going on. But have you ever sat down to think, all right, what's the real problem here? Let me hear these people. How have they been hurt? And instead of being mad over things that are opinionated, being mad over things that really won't go into eternity, why don't we find things that find the true purpose behind what we're doing here? We're here to reach people. And as we see what we need to do, we need to be looking at and finding things that don't have eternal value and just get rid of that. Don't worry about that. But be concerned about the things that do have eternal value. Have you taken time to make a friend with someone that doesn't think like you or share your values? You know what I'm learning, and I thank God for this. I don't have to think like people to love them. They don't have to have the same values as I have to love them. You look at Jesus. I mean, he's the greatest example that we have. Who did Jesus spend time with? He spent time with the people that were not allowed to go to the temple. Why? Because their values didn't line up with the religious people of the day. And so he loved people, and people knew it. He reached into their culture. He reached into the culture of a sinner. He reached into the culture of a person who's an outcast of their time. And he loved them. And you know what? They became his disciples. And they're in heaven today. Why? Because Jesus. Why am I going to be going to heaven? It's not by the work that I have done. It's because of the work that Jesus has done. And so what we need to do is we need to go to those people. And you know, you think about this. I know that there are some people out there that are just mean. And I know that there are people out there that are just crazy. They're just nuts. That's just part of life. You're going to find that. But do you realize that Jesus died for them too? That Jesus is calling them to salvation as well. You know, Jesus said, if I'm lifted up, talking about going to the cross, I'm going to draw all men to me. I'm going to draw all people to me. And so either Jesus is telling the truth or he's a liar. And I have not found him to lie about anything. And so those mean people, those crazy people that's hard to have a conversation with, Jesus loves them. But you know, there were crazy people in the time of the Bible. Matter of fact, the guy who's writing the book that we're reading out of right now was a man who was mean. He was crazy enough to go around and kill any Christian he could find. His name was Saul of Tarsus. And we know him today as Paul. So you never know. The next person that you build that, you reach into their culture, the next person that you befriend, and you just let the cultural things that really don't matter, just let it slide. Don't get mad at it. Don't get upset about it. Just love that person. Because you never know when the Holy Spirit's going to be leading you to the next Paul. You never know what God's going to be doing. And so as we serve the Lord and we reach into these cultures, guys, I love America and I love my freedom. But my freedom's not more important than someone becoming a Christian. And so therefore, reach in, love, and friend, and see some become Christians. Some trust Jesus as their Savior. And who knows? I always love to hear stories about different people, and I hear their gospel story, and how that some preacher that I have never heard of has led this person who's gone on to be a huge success in preaching the gospel, reaching people I've never even imagined being able to be reached, just because one person took time to love a crazy, mean person. And you never know what God's going to do. So let's not forget, if we're going to preach the gospel, it's not just a bunch of words. It's the actions, it's the attitude, it's the love that we have, willing to listen to people that don't think like we are, so that we can find that common ground and share the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's do that today. And I thank you guys for listening. Y'all have a wonderful day and stay warm.